Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're doing a different kind of show. We're going to be looking at a few different legal cases or situations from across Canada that are a little bit quirky or funny. And we're joined today by two of the quirkiest and funniest lawyers I know, Ryan O'Connor and Karima Saad. Thank you both for joining me for this different type of show. Now, the cases we're going to be talking about aren't going to the Supreme Court, and they're probably not going to make a big impact on the future of law in Canada. But we're going to talk about them because I thought they were interesting, and they made me laugh. So I hope they make you guys laugh, too. So thanks for joining. The first case I want to talk about is probably actually the most serious of the bunch, and it went all the way to the BC Court of Appeal. It's a case about an annulment of a marriage because the couple never consummated the marriage. So this is probably something that you guys and the viewers, you've seen on sitcoms, but getting a marriage annulled because it wasn't consummated is actually not easy to do. In fact, the hardest part of this marriage was probably getting it annulled. Thanks, I'm here all night. The test for annulment on the ground that the marriage could not be consummated because the existing test of failure to consummate is because of physical inability or psychological incapacity. So Karima, what can you tell me about this BC case? What happened?
So here we had a young couple that wanted to live together, but didn't feel comfortable doing that without at least the civil ceremony. So they lived in separate rooms in a household shared with others, didn't consummate their marriage because they hadn't yet undergone the traditional religious gurdwara ceremony. And in between moving together and their civil ceremony and the religious one that never happened, the relationship kind of fell apart, and they decided, they never ended up consummating, and they decided to part ways. And that's where the annulment came in. And the question was whether that was sufficient, because had they simply just decided not to, and ultimately the Court of Appeal found that actually it was in accordance with their cultural norms, and that kind of religious underpinning is the reason that they were unable to consummate.
So Ryan, the existing test that I set out, which is for an annulment for not consummating, there's a physical or psychological reason you can't consummate. That comes from an old case called Heil and Heil. Heil and Heil. Can you tell us about that case?
Sure, Christine. I can provide a brief summary, perhaps not the usual penetrating legal analysis that you would expect from your guests, but that was a case in the late 1940s, and it was a case involving a couple that had got married and then set sail, as you did back in the day, for North America. And then the couple went their separate ways. The wife went to New Hampshire and then I believe traveled through the United States for a period of time. So they were married for some period, and eventually there was an application for divorce. And the court found in that case, and the test that still survives today in Canadian law, was that there has to be, as you quite rightly stated, a psychological or physical incapacity as a reason to seek the annulment on the basis of non-consummation of the marriage. In that case, the court had found that the mere unwillingness to consummate the marriage was actually insufficient in order to rise to the occasion of being able to grant a divorce in the circumstances. So interestingly enough, our court still continued to apply that test, although obviously the BC Court of Appeal case you cited is also interesting insofar as it now, I think, allows us to better reflect Canada's multicultural norms and mores.
I mean, I think that if the test was just unwillingness or like, I have a headache, I'm tired, there would be a lot of opportunity for annulment. And I think that's not what the court wants. So Karima, in this new case, they've set sort of a new criteria, which is sincere religious belief. Do you think that's going to have an impact on future cases, or is this sort of a one-off in our society today?
I don't know how common, the situation will be, especially with changing attitudes towards premarital sex. But having said that, it is significant, I think, that the concept of incapacity was extended to a religious belief, and that's maybe, reflective of how a certain segment of society feels.
Ryan, we've got about 15 seconds. Any thoughts on future impact?
I agree with Karima. I think it opens the door to a more broad analysis of what constitutes incapacity, and accepts that Canada's multicultural experience is really the experience of a lot of married couples nowadays.
Welcome back to Canadian Justice and our special episode about odd and funny legal cases and situations. So I want to talk about something I saw recently on Twitter, and it was an employment lawyer who was doing a discovery online, which is for the non-lawyers in the audience when you ask witness questions. And in the middle of the discovery, on camera, the witness got up and started going to the bathroom. Throughout, he continued to answer questions, although apparently he would not answer the question, "Are you going to the bathroom right now?" So Karima, this wasn't your case, but if it was, what do you do in that situation?
Well, I'd be pretty pissed. I honestly, the fact that the camera was on, I think makes it all the more troublesome. I think, I probably would want to call for a break or a recess, and that's probably going to damage the transcript the least amount. Let's go off the record for a moment. Not so simple to do in court, though.
So Ryan, what would you do? And just so our viewers know, as Karima mentioned, these discoveries are transcribed. So I am kind of wondering what the transcript of this discovery is going to look like.
Well, it's going to look like an absolute mess, potentially after, almost like what that bathroom might look like if you were, doing this during the context of an examination. But, I would say if it was my witness, I'd be thinking in my head, the case has gone down the toilet, literally and frankly, figuratively as well. If it was my witness, I'd be calling, just for a break to go off the record. Whether or not counsel would grant that is another thing entirely. And if I was the examining lawyer, I just continue to examine. But I wouldn't ask that question first about whether or not you're in the bathroom. I want to say, sir, it looks like you're in the bathroom, and then just lay out a whole series of questions to lay the traps. That the witness is in a position of vulnerability at that point. They're not fully concentrating on the questions, and if I was cross-examining that individual, instead of trying to get off the record, I'd stay on, continue to examine them, and hopefully get some admissions that might not be too helpful to their case.
Always strategizing, Ryan. That's why you're such a great lawyer. So Karima, have you encountered any of your own kind of Zoom fails? What's the most ridiculous thing that you've seen in Zoom discovery or in Zoom court?
Well, I think that Zoom court wasn't really prepared for the amount of interest in some of the anti-lockdown cases. And in particular, some of the interest comes from fans who can be a little bit passionate and maybe not so on top of court decorum. So in one of the Adam Skelly cases, we had people who logged on with sort of all sorts of offensive or not necessarily offensive names, but, there is no justice, like things like that in the courtroom, kind of unmuting themselves to chime in with the judge. And in fact, the judge herself couldn't join initially because the courtroom was at capacity. So there was this negotiation, and I think one of the lawyers, the lead lawyers, also was stuck in the waiting room. So it was maybe more of a technical glitch, but kind of amusing to see sort of a circus in the courtroom.
I actually had a similar case like that. We were involved in a major public quarantine hotel case, and there were, I think, 400 guests in the Zoom room at one point, and when the Crown started making their arguments, someone was able to unmute themselves and whistled through the first 5 minutes of the Crown's submissions, which I have to say is not helpful for your side. If you're doing this to distract the Crown, it is not helping, so do not do that. Ryan, how about you? What have you seen in Zoom court or in these Zoom discoveries?
But a similar situation to what you described, Christine. I was actually observing a fairly prominent case because it related to a case in which I'm involved on behalf of my clients. And during the morning break, it appeared that the registrar had not muted any of the members of the public who had come to appear. And there were dozens, if not hundreds, of members of the public. And you could hear them on the audio commenting on the quality of the judge, the quality of counsel, and making some, very pointed remarks about them. And I also don't think they realized that they were on a joint audio. Some of them who started chiming in, I don't think they did, because you could hear washrooms in the background because they were taking their morning break as well. So it was this was interesting, and the registrar just, I don't know, didn't realize and didn't mute everyone, and you could hear this going on. I just hopeful that the judge and the lawyers had gone and taken their morning break and muted. So that's sort of one of the more humorous instances that I've seen during COVID times.
When we are back, we're going to talk about some more of these entertaining stories. Welcome back to Canadian Justice and our special episode about odd and funny legal cases or situations. Now, it wouldn't be fair to have a conversation with Karima and Ryan together if we didn't talk about COVID, because I know you are both very active and opinionated about this, especially on Twitter. So Karima, you have sort of made a name for yourself by going to these regular protests about lockdowns in Toronto and documenting some of the sort of strange things that you see at them. So I want to ask you, what are some of the funniest things that you have seen at these COVID protests?
I would say there's a lot of creativity with the signs, both, artistically speaking, creative with the substance that they're putting on the signs. And there's no shortage of like bizarre outfits and chants, and it's really a mixed crowd, I would say. So that's sort of my take on it. I saw a sign yesterday that was, "I've never seen Hitler and Justin Trudeau in the same room," and it was just like totally. And the man was in a chicken suit. So it's a weird time. It's a weird time.
So Ryan, you aren't at these protests, but I know, like many people, you take issue with some of the COVID restrictions that you believe have gone too far. So what are your views of some of the things that are going on at these protests?
I think that the fact that these protests are occurring, I think at least on a weekly basis, if not more frequently, speaks to a general undercurrent that not a lot of people are paying attention to. There's a lot of frustration that underlies these protests. Persons who are there have very different reasons for being there. They may have had a business that was closed during the shutdown or the two previous lockdowns. They may have had a family member, impacted by COVID insofar as they might not have been able to visit them in the hospital. They might have had a funeral canceled. These are all very valid and legitimate reasons why anyone would protest. And frankly, it's not about validity at all. If you want to protest, you have a constitutional right to do so. So that's what's really underlying the protests. And I agree with Karima. From what it seems to be, I've not been to one, but from what it seems to be, it's persons from all walks of life, business owners, regular people who have all been affected in their own individual ways by the pandemic. And I often say that some of the reasons why they're protesting relate to the parallel pandemic of job loss, the parallel pandemic of not being able to hold a funeral, the parallel pandemic of not being able to attend in person to worship the faith that you choose to worship. So that is really an undercurrent, and a lot of the coverage seems to be about, who's acting, aggressively at a protest or who's doing this, when I think it speaks to a larger problem that a lot of people are ignoring.
So I certainly understand people being unhappy and wanting to protest. I don't know where the chicken suit comes in, but I do understand the sentiment of being unhappy. Karima, I want to ask you about this one guy who's at all these protests and who's become pretty infamous. His name's Chris Skye. So why is everybody so obsessed with this Chris Skye guy? Who is he? And what's the appeal? And I know that there have been some pretty serious charges related to some things he's done and said. So what can you tell me about that?
Chris Skye is a cartoon character come to life. And I think I think people are fascinated because there's maybe this tendency to want to watch train wrecks. And this is a train wreck in slow motion. So Chris Skye is the son of a wealthy developer in Vaughan, King City. And really gained notoriety at the outset for being dismissive and ignoring the Quarantine Act rules in coming from the airport, and then going into grocery stores without a mask and kind of haranguing the employees, and sort of that was his shtick. And so he throughout this has set up various charities that aren't really registered charities and has collected a fair bit of money. He has a book that's more of a pamphlet, but a very charismatic personality, and people within this movement, not everyone, I think that he's still a divisive character, but they follow him like a Pied Piper. So he's attracted this, and kind of the flip side of it is people who want to see where it goes. But you're right that he's facing really serious charges, including uttering death threats to elected officials, including Doug Ford, attempting to run over a police officer while he was fleeing from an arrest. And he's on his 8th bail right now. And so, he is someone who drums up controversy, and I think is in some ways profiting off of this pandemic.
We're going to be right back after this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice and our special episode about odd and funny legal cases and situations. So this next case is from Halifax, and it's been in the news a lot for being kind of silly and a bit ridiculous. A man named Lorne Grabher had a personalized license plate in Nova Scotia bearing his surname, Grabher. Lorne had actually had his license plate for about 30 years, and it was finally recalled by the province's Registrar of Motor Vehicles in 2016 after a member of the public saw it and complained. Now, Mr. Grabher, Lorne, I guess I'll call him Lorne, took the matter to court, arguing that the recall of his vanity license plate violated his freedom of expression. Now, Mr. O'Connor, what can you tell me about the case and how it got this far?
You certainly have to admire Mr. Grabher's gumption in terms of litigating this, all the way to the Court of Appeal. But just to very briefly summarize, this is an individual who, for almost, I believe it was 3 decades, had his surname on his license plate in Nova Scotia, Grabher, spelled phonetically, and finally he was unable to continue having his vanity license plate. So instead of just putting something different on his plate for the next 27 years, he did what some people who are very principled do in these circumstances, is he took the government to court and argued that his free expression was being violated because the registrar denied his ability to renew his license plate. So he did make an argument that this violated Section 2B of the Charter of Rights, which protects freedom of expression. It went to the lower courts and was appealed, and his appeal was eventually dismissed. And as it stands now, Mr. Grabher can no longer have Grabher on his license plate.
So, Ms. Saad, there are all kinds of vanity license plates that get denied every year. You can Google it. CBC runs a list every year of all kinds of really ridiculous curse words, racist words, just jokes. All kinds of license plates get denied every year. But is that a charter issue? I mean, or is the issue here that he had it for so long, and it does that play into making it somehow a charter issue?
Yeah, I think part of the reason this went so far is that it had been his long-standing license plate, and so what he perceived as an abrupt change, was he took issue with that. But the fact is that a license plate, and this is ultimately how the court decided, a license plate is more akin to a piece of ID, where it's a highly regulated form of expression and not really something within the 2 to 7 characters that you have that's used for any meaningful sort of expression. And so it was found that actually the charter didn't extend to this license plate.
So, Mr. O'Connor, what do you think? Do you think that there was a real charter argument here that needed to be assessed?
Well, and I tend to be somewhat of a free expression absolutist in the sense I think more expression is always better. But It's the venue within which that expression is contemplated is the real issue. And we're talking about a license plate. It's Crown property. It's the government's property. I mean, there would be much more of a case if he had spray painted grabber on the side of his vehicle or painted it on in really fancy and bright colors. And there's a very clear, and the government banned it. Maybe the Registrar of Motor Vehicles said you can't have grabber on the side of your car. That might be a much stronger charter argument because it's not on the Crown property, it's on your own personal property and you like to drive around with your surname. But then the courts will also question the value of the speech. You know, this isn't political speech, for example, where the courts take a slightly different perspective in terms of protecting speech. So again, it's a court would see it as speech that's less worthy being protected than, say, for example, political speech. So, I mean, there's other venues within which, there might be a stronger argument, but I don't think there's a strong argument.
Ms. Saad, we've got about 20 seconds. Your thoughts on the use of judicial resources on this case?
With so much backlog, it's as you say, a principled stance, but, I think one that maybe was clogging up the system in my respectful opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there is a huge backlog now because of COVID and just because there's always a backlog. I want to thank you both for coming on today for this special show about sort of funny legal cases.
Thank you.
We've heard today about some strange and entertaining legal cases and situations that have captured public attention. Law is an incredible profession that has continued to challenge and delight me throughout my career. While most of our time as lawyers is focused on the daily grind and lawyers are often seen as pretty serious, I'm happy I have an opportunity to sometimes show you the lighter side of law. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.